It's David with Yellow Weld. I am checking in to do a quick tutorial video on the Yellow Sprout Estimator. So first things first, let's pop over to the terms and conditions of use. You should have already seen this before you were able to download it, but we'll just get into it. Basically, we spent a bunch of time and energy building this so that we could give it away for free and help other people. So please don't steal it. Please don't use it for anything it was not intended to be used for. Only edit the yellow cells. In fact, it would be a great idea to set up permissions to protect all other cells other than the yellow ones so that you do not destroy this tool on accident. So read through that and please abide by it, because we do want to continue to be able to make free content, but if too much of our stuff gets stolen or abused, obviously that might have to change. But anyway, let's pop into the overhead tab. This is probably where you would want to start after you download this tool. On the left-hand side, we have a whole list of suggested expenses that you could put down in here. This will depend on your business. Obviously, all businesses are different and will have their own expenses. One thing that I do recommend is that you are somewhat conservative with these numbers, such as marketing, for example. If you don't have money for marketing now and you do not put money into this column to budget for it, it is very likely that you will not have money for marketing in the future either, because you are not budgeting for it. So in my own personal case, I have fairly conservative numbers in here so that I am budgeting for things that I may or may not even be spending money on quite yet. And that's just a growth mindset. Now we're going to pop over to employees and earnings. We have employees 1, 2, and 3. You can change the names on those. Everything in yellow is editable. You can set these up to be hourly or salary employees. If it's salary, this rate cell will be where you would put their annual salary. If they are an hourly employee, that is where you put their hourly rate. How many weekly hours are they going to be working? Are they full-time or are they part-time? Are they doing overtime? Yearly weeks, how many weeks in a year are you expecting them to be working, regardless of whether or not they get paid or unpaid time off. And that multiplies out into the total available hours in a year. Now we have field utilization. So this is not about production rates. This is not to hound your employees. This is more so for smaller employers that maybe each person is wearing several hats and doing an array of different work for the business. So if you have guys that are in the field producing the work as well as coming in and out of the office doing sales or estimation or anything like that, this is how you would count for that. So if someone spends half their time in the field, you should put 50% field utilization in this cell. We, as a small business, use this a lot to make sure that we are keeping track of a realistic number of billable hours. So this will reduce their available hours by a percentage to produce our conservative estimation of the billable hours. So now we have some summations here under expense summary. We have our annual salaries. Anything that was listed as salary gets put here. Our annual overhead will come from this column over here. And unbillable hours. So anyone that's got a field utilization of less than 100%, that remaining time is going to be multiplied out by their rate, and that will be added up here, because regardless of whether they are on a billable hour, if they are working, you should pay them. So this is how you're going to pay them, is you are going to bill for that time in your overhead, basically. So that sums up down here to be your total annual cost of doing business, your annual expenses in your business. Under utilization potential, this is another important area that we can look at. So base billable hours is going to be a summation of all your billable hours up here. Your efficiency, again, is not your production rates or production speed. This is more about a reasonable approximation of how much time you will be producing work in a year at the rate that you think you will be. So do you have any seasonalities in your business? Do you plow snow for a living? Because if you do, there's a good chance that you will not be busy 100% of the year unless you live in a climate that has snow 100% of the time. So I personally keep mine around 75%. I do not recommend setting it any higher than 90%. If you're busy all the time, 90% is something you could set it at. However, if you set it lower, it will raise your rates, and perhaps you will be working a little bit less and making the same amount of money. So that's something to consider as well. If you are highly seasonal, you're going to have to look at kind of what percentage of the year that you intend to work or that you expect to work, and whether or not you expect that work to then pay your expenses for the whole year, or whether you have alternate options for income. So under total billable hours, we take the base billable hours, it is reduced by the efficiency to our total billable hours and what we're actually anticipating. So below this, we have our mean pay rate. This is just the average of the hourly pay rates that we have listed above, and our hourly burden. So this is taking our total expenses and we divide it by our total billable hours. And that will come up with a number that we need to charge per man hour to go towards all of these expenses. So on the right hand side over here, we have rates. And we have our projected net numbers. These are not true net numbers because true net numbers have to come into play after we've done the job and we have job costed. But we can project these net numbers because we are factoring in our overhead costs. So at the first one, we go from 0 all the way up to 30%. At 0, this rate will be your mean pay rate and your hourly burden added together. So you will make no money for the company. All your bills will get paid, your workers will get paid, but the company walks away with nothing per man hour. And this is just a direct scale, so 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30%. So you'll be able to see the rate that is calculated for that margin and the profit per man hour that you expect. So this is really useful when you are bidding jobs and you kind of need to know, how much is going to be in the bank at the end of this job if we win, that is free game to spend, because you do not want to be spending money that should belong elsewhere or is wrapped up in some other expense. So once that is all set, it's sort of set it and forget it. I do recommend checking back, once a week, once a month, whatever it may be. If your expenses change or your workforce changes or the rates that you are paying your employees are changing, then your numbers are going to change. So you need to make sure that you are staying on top of this page to make sure that it remains accurate to the climate that you're in as a business. So check back often and make sure that it still looks appropriate. We're going to hop over to the Overview tab now. This is for inputs and an output. So this is basically your primary dashboard. Over here we have a spot for you to put your logo and some of your information so that you have letterhead on this page. You've got a prepared by range so you can put your estimator's name in here, and that's going to be important because at the end of this you should be saving this whole workbook as a PDF document and logging it into an archive so that you have good data to go back upon and look at, because basically it's just as important to know what you had charged for a previous job as it is to know what was your business at the time that that job was done. If your expenses were different or your manpower was different, then what you charged then might not make sense to charge now. And it's very important to be able to see both aspects of that. So like I said, you're going to want to save this whole workbook as a PDF and log it away in an archive. So you have some ranges to put your estimate numbers, your invoice numbers, if those are different by your naming conventions, whatever that may be, your customer name, their location, the date. We're going to follow down the left-hand side. Under job parameters, we have scope tasks. So these are going to be the larger overarching tasks. You can write whatever you need to write in and the quantities. So this is going to be tricky for some of you to make this work, partially because some of you are selling services and some of you will be selling products, like tangible products. For my business, we sell mostly services, but occasionally tangible products. So it's built more with that in mind because that's what I'm most familiar with. A lot of the work that we do is field work, so we have ranges for travel expenses and per diem. If this is not something that's relevant in your business, you can zero out these quantities and just leave that as it is. So how many people are going to be needed for this job? How far away is it from our location? And then the scope notes. The scope notes are very important for your records when you save this as a PDF later. I would recommend putting the same information in your scope notes as you would put in your contract document or in your estimate details or your invoice details to describe the scope of work. Because when you look back on this a year from now, it's important to know what this estimate actually entailed, what it was about, what was covered, what wasn't covered, who was responsible for paying for what, and what you were and were not responsible for. So this is where you put all of that for your records later. We're going to shoot across the bottom to company parameters. This is where you're going to set all the details for this particular job. This is going to auto-populate your mean pay rate down here. You can set your labor rate. Before you set that, I highly recommend each job clicking into your overhead, looking at your rates, deciding what rate you intend to charge for which projected margin you are shooting for, and take that rate and put it in this box. No more, no less. If that's what you want your margin to be, that's the rate that you should be putting in there. Now your office rate, if you bill for anything different, for say engineering time, inspection time, architectural drawing, anything like that, if you have a different rate, that is where you would put that in. And then overhead, or not overhead, overtime. So if you're charging for overtime, it can vary how people do this in kind of a business-to-business setting, and I have not found there to be one concrete convention. So I've made this something that you can edit to suit the way that you do business. So it's in here for time and a half right now. You could do time and a quarter, you could do time and 35%, whatever makes sense for you. So now we have hours per day. This is our overtime calculation. It is too difficult to figure out how to include an overhead calculation on a weekly basis for a bunch of strangers' business models. To be honest, I don't really know the best way to do that because all of you are going to do your own production rates differently and your production scheduling differently. And I think that it's just too difficult to know how to encompass all of those things. But hours per day seems like a way that we can kind of shoehorn this in a little bit. So basically it's going to be overtime over 8 hours per day, and you can use that to set your basically your days on site. So if you fill this out and it says that you're going to have X number of days on site and you're trying to get that down, you can play with this number hours per day to see how many hours a day need to be worked in order to hit your deadline. And then you've got ranges for mileage rate, drive labor rate if it varies from your labor rate, and per diem rate. With all of that in mind, we're going to skip this section here because this is the output, and we will go to the labor next. So the labor, it's one convention basically all the way across, repeated a few times. Over here you've got office type tasks and general labor type tasks. So this is where your office rate is going to be billed differently in this range. I've left these particular fields editable so that you can fill in the values that make sense for your business, whether it be prospecting and estimating, or maybe drafting and engineering, or anything like that, whatever makes sense to you. You have a way of including or excluding it from the scope. So if you want to be charging for these details, you must have this included. If you want to see what your estimate would look like without those things, you can uncheck those boxes and keep all of your values here. So you can put in the time per task in minutes or hours. If you prefer hours, or it makes more sense to put in hours, then you need to check this box to convert the calculations into hours. How many people are going to be working on this task, and is it cooperative or independent? This is a very important one because it greatly increases or decreases the number of man hours something can take. So to give you an example, if you had 10 items that needed to be fabricated, are you able to, say you have 2 welders to do it, are you able to give those 10 items to the 2 welders to work together to work on 1 item at a time until all 10 are done? Or are you able to give 5 items to each welder and have them each produce 5? This makes a significant difference in your man hours and therefore your price, so it is good to be familiar with this. So as an example, we have prospecting, but we have a bunch of different tasks listed here that you can fill out. This thick black line is supposed to represent where the specific scope goes. So you can imagine all of this just shoehorned right here, but these are the ones that don't really change, so I put them side by side. So these are meant to be pre-scope details and post-scope details. So the site inspection and GC meeting when I first arrived to a work site. And then we have like tool pack up and cleanup and waste disposal at the end of the job. So those are kind of what's dividing those things. And then in the black line is where the actual scope of the project comes into play. So under the scope specific functions, these will automatically populate with the values that you wrote in for the overview as well as the quantities. And you will fill out the same way as everything above it. Beneath here, I've left some unallocated tasks. So these are ranges that you can fill out that are maybe not so specific to be part of the scope, but are included. As a good example, say you needed to fabricate or machine 10,000 parts and you had to deburr each one. It would be very easy to not spend much time thinking about how long it would take to do that, but it may be worth your time, because there's 10,000 parts, to put 10,000 parts in for quantity, say 2 minutes of deburring each, say 1 person to deburr, and include all of these included scope and whatever else. And it can add up to be a sizable amount of money. So it's important to estimate even the small details that are often overlooked, because if you don't, then you are basically paying out of pocket to do that, or you are working for free. So one common ones that are in my industry would be deburring, painting, maybe sandblasting, grinding, anything like that. If we have a large quantity of it where it would be hard to add it to the total scope above, it's good to put here. But basically at the end of all of this, what we have is we have a column where it totals your man hours and a column where it totals your line price based on whether it's an office rate or a labor rate, which is defined in your overview. And at the top we have our total man hours and our total labor cost. And that rounds us out for the estimation portion of this. So then we are going to go to this section here. How many man hours are we expecting? How many days on site or days of work is this going to take? And we have 2 columns here. We have build and cost. So build is what the client pays, and cost is what it costs you to produce. So you will see your labor cost will be determined by your mean pay rate, and it will take your hours and it will multiply by your mean pay rate, and that would be what it costs you to produce that. Your overhead, or your overtime rather, you have a box on whether or not to include that. So if you are in a situation where it maybe doesn't make sense to charge overtime, or you've just got whatever circumstance where it doesn't make sense, you can uncheck that or check that, and it will populate the numbers in these ranges. Your assorted COGS, so anything that is a cost of goods sold that isn't included explicitly elsewhere, would fit in here, whether that be blades, paint, glue, drill bits, grinding wheels, whatever it may be. This is where you'd put that along with your materials. And again, we have a build and a cost range for these things. If you do not have a vendor's license in your state, you should get a vendor's license in your state so that you can mark up your materials and your expenses to pay for the amount of time that it takes you to estimate, collect, and keep inventory of these items. So you would put your cost and then the build cost side by side. The rounded value is sort of a useful tool. It's really just for squaring up numbers. So if you had an invoice that came out to be, say, $510 and you wanted to just sell it for $500 even, you could put -10 into this box, and that just subtracts $10. Or you could do it the other way. Say your invoice comes out to $490 and you would like to charge $500. You can put +10 in there and it will bump that up to $500. It's really only used as a rounding tool. Now we have per diem. You can check or uncheck that box depending on whether it is applicable for what you are doing. And then you have an editable range here where you can put in your projected expenses on lodging, etc. The same is true for mileage. So it will automatically populate your build based on miles from your location. And you can put your projected fuel cost and whatever else into there. And then we have the drive labor hours. If your workers are often driving to a work site in substantial distances, it's a good idea. It's actually paramount to charge for that. So here's where you could put that in, and it will bill and cost based on your drive labor rate. So at the end of this, we have two summations, one of the build and one of the cost. So what this does, what this has all been for, and we're working up to a drum roll here, is our invoice total. And then we have our COGS budget, our total COGS budget. So what is the cost of producing this job? Of that cost, how much of it is labor? And then we have our gross profit and our gross profit margin. So this is what we really want to see, because this is what tells us whether or not our estimate is healthy or not. So one resource that I highly recommend is following Tom Reber with Contractor Fight. It's an excellent Facebook group. It's an excellent YouTube channel. They offer free and paid training and coaching, whether it be in business management or sales. I'm not affiliated with them. I get nothing for saying this. It is simply an excellent resource that I found to be highly useful in my self-education process when I became a new business owner, and I cannot recommend them enough. So if you do follow Tom Reber at all, or you are willing to take my advice based on Tom Reber's advice, what I recommend is a gross profit margin of 50% or better. And this is really important because if you are doing jobs where you are collecting deposits on these jobs, what's typical for me is to collect a 50% deposit on jobs. And if I have a gross profit margin of 50% or better, my cost to do the job is paid for by that deposit in full. And what that means is that I do not have to front money for other people's projects. I am not a bank. I am a welding company. So it's very important that I do not overextend myself trying to leverage my own finances to pay for other people's work. So keep an eye on your gross profit margin and your gross profit, and this will be the largest indicators on whether or not this job is worth worth selling at the rate that you intend to, or what you have to do to get it to the proper rates. So you can edit that by rounding the value. You can get that by changing your labor rates if you need to. But that is what I recommend. So this is kind of a front to back quick tutorial on the Yellow Sprout Estimator. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. If your business is not fitting super well within the layout of this, or maybe you have more employees, or maybe there's just some information that you wish you had that wasn't in here, please reach out and talk to us. We'd love to make something that fits your scenario a little bit better. We're hoping to build something that can be useful for nearly every business type and every business model. And we'd love to work with you and figure out how we can put something together that would be useful to you. So thanks for checking in. We hope you love the tool. Let us know. Take care.